We are recording. It says connecting to cloud server. All right, here we are. Hi, folks. Welcome to this last session. Oh my gosh, bittersweet moment of season 2 of the Public Eye Seminar. It's my pleasure today to welcome Sarah Myers-West, co-executive director of AI Now, to talk about AI nationalisms. I think it's be an extremely interesting session I've been looking forward to really pretty much all season. Um, Sarah, in that case, I will let you take it away with the presentation. Oh, and just a point of order for folks, as I think everybody here knows, the first 30 minutes of the session are recorded and they will be posted publicly at archive.org once archive.org, recovers from its most recent attack. And then the remainder of the session will be held under, not recorded, and held under Chatham House rules. All right, sir, pass it to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you all today. The Chatham House rule. So yeah, I am here to present some of the work that we've been doing at AI Now, and actually wanted to take this opportunity to kind of workshop some things that Amba and I have been writing together for a piece that might come out fairly soon. So what I'll be sharing is kind of some work in progress, and then in the Q&A, happy to sort of talk more generally about the report that Joshua shared with you in advance, but wanted to take the opportunity to, particularly with this group of minds who have been thinking really deeply about public AI issues, to sort of take stock of where we are at right now. So I'm going to share slides really quickly. Give me one moment to share my screen. Oops, that is the wrong share. That's what I wanted. Everybody can see and hear okay? Excellent. So what we've been thinking through is this really gnarly problem that I think has cropped up in the conversation around public AI, which is how to, really wrestle with the, dynamics of concentrated power. And the thesis that we're operating from is that for the AI market, concentration is really a feature, not a bug. And so let me unpack how we got there. So in our 2023 report, AI Now sort of unpacked that there really is no AI without big tech firms. And this is a diagnosis that many competition enforcement agencies have arrived on. If you look to the recent work of the FTC, the DOJ, to the CMA's report, there's this consistent diagnosis that the ecosystem surrounding the development of artificial intelligence has these very core dependencies on resources that large tech firms have, dominant control over. This is also the presumption that a number of efforts focused on the development of public AI operate from. If you look, for example, to some of the reports from the NIAC, the thesis for why we need to move toward the democratization of AI is because of this heavy dependency on big tech resources. So how did we get here? Looking at sort of the trajectory of the field's development over the last, decade and a half, you can see that 2012 becomes a really key inflection point for the field. That, that was sort of a point at which firms like Google had already, sufficiently piloted the development of commercial surveillance techniques, that there were, these large pools of data on which to train AI systems. You see the development of sufficient amounts of computational infrastructure. And you also see, the crystallization of work happening within tech firms' AI labs. And so this is sort of a point at which you see the publication of the AlexNet paper as sort of this step change and inflection point for the field. It's the moment where it then crystallizes what can be done when you put together large scale compute, massive amounts of data, and contingent labor. And Meredith Whitaker and Alex Hanna have both published, I think, really useful genealogical work looking at AlexNet as this critical moment in the development of AI research techniques. Now, we, like many folks in this room, have been somewhat critical of the current trajectory, both that AI as it exists is defined by these high levels of concentration of power. The field has been significantly shaped by work that relies on those resources, and that the current sort of bigger is better paradigm carries with it many ancillary challenges because of manifold harms ranging from discrimination to the climate costs, to the impact on labor, to the impact on creative communities, as you were just talking about the importance of bringing folks from those communities into these conversations. And this critique is one of the threads that I think has led to public AI as a project, trying to redirect the trajectory towards one that's going to serve the public interest. Now, one of the concerns raised, as I previewed at the start of this talk, is that without careful calibration, there's a risk that public AI won't meaningfully contest the dominance of big firms, but will in fact reinforce them. Sorry, I have a click through here. So you can look, for example, at the scale of investment coming from government agencies compared to the scale of what tech firms are spending, and it's going to be very difficult to reach that level scale where you're going to be able to sufficiently address the resource imbalance. Similarly, those firms are really the ones who are best served by the scale hypothesis because of that domination of the resources needed to build AI, even as they seek support for more, whether that's supporting efforts to build out more data centers or unblock the bottlenecks that are presented by the lack of sufficient energy reserves. They're also best served by the monetization potential posed by the investment because they have a level of ecosystem control, controlling marketplaces that are seamlessly integrated with their clouds. So looking at this picture, one thing that struck us is that the past is really instructive here. Oh, sorry, here's my picture from the CMA of what that ecosystem power looks like. You can see the manifold places where there is dominance reinforced across different points of the stack, as well as the ecosystem for the deployment of AI technologies. So we can look to history because this sort of inflection point is not necessarily exactly the same as in the past, but it does mirror past moments in AI's history. For example, in the 1980s, Reagan's Strategic Computing Initiative attempted many of the same components, making significant investment in computational resources, but ultimately it was shut down because of the recognition that anything resembling the kinds of grand advancements promised would require, an almost endlessly scaling amount of compute and data. And so we can see our present moment as a continuation of this template rather than a break from it. That said, I think that the public AI conversation is a juncture that we could be utilizing to reset those terms. And in particular, to reset them by thinking about the kind of world that we would want to live in rather than, sort of making tweaks on the margins of the one that's been handed to us. And so I think it would be really useful at this particular moment to try and sort of step back from the current research trajectory of the field, but think about what are some of the undercurrents that were left behind. If we were to think about, rehydrating the research space to consider other possibilities for AI development and other places that AI might better serve. If we don't, I think we risk investing in AI as a solution in search of its problem. Trying to find societal problems that are fit for the technology that exists, rather than building from the problems that need solving and adapting technology to help us address them. In the conversation around democratization of AI, there's been a lot of conversation about trying to get, a more diverse community seats at the table, presuming that that's going to act as a meaningful curb on the significant corporate power that's already been amassed in the field. But this idea of involving those affected loses its meaning when you look at the structural power of the big firms and the usage of technology to occupy and compound harms on those that they'd be giving voice to. That's what sort of leaves us stuck in this place of AI as a solution in search of its problem. I think the more subversive prompt would be to ask, what forms of innovation would be supportive of different centers of power and expertise that exist outside of industry? That's not necessarily going to lead us to AI. AI might just be a part of that larger trajectory. And in this context, the most impactful way to redirect the conversation is to entirely decenter the technology itself and instead reclaim democratic control over who gets to define what counts as innovation and invention. And we've seen writers and animators and nurses and other worker groups begin to show us this path as they fight not only for fair value distribution of AI as it exists, but instead to have a say in defining what passes muster as innovation in the first place. So you look to the WGA contract where the writers were able to successfully argue against the studios that they get to have a deciding role in where AI is going to be used. National Nurses United has outlined a vision for technology that is inherently worker-centric by design and reclaims nurses' expertise in what would genuinely act in patients' interest. And they're the ones who are interfacing with patients day by day. And I say all this, with a particular point in mind. We, as I think many other folks who have, occupied a more critical space in relation to AI, have, I think, been put in a frustrating place where we're constantly trying to both be generative and then come up with quick solutions to what are entrenched and really gnarly societal problems. And so I think it's important to reclaim the idea of critique as inherently generative and inherently optimistic, because critique it operates from a view that there is a better world that can be constructed. And the reason to critique is because we want to be taking steps toward that world rather than just putting a gloss on the one that currently exists. So I'm going to leave it here as a provocation for a more open conversation. And and look forward to hearing questions or ideas or other thoughts that you have.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sarah. Um, so if folks have questions, feel free to just use the Zoom raise hand question. If you have something that's immediately relevant, do that and hold up 2 fingers. And I'll get us started. Oh my gosh, what kind of, well, okay. Something that immediately jumped out at me was looking at that scary slide of ecosystem power and the same 4 or so logos showing up across every part of the stack. It is actually kind of scary. Um, one thought I was wondering is, obviously a lot of what you have been doing, in that AI nationalism sort of series is talking about industrial policy, where governments can intervene. And, one thought there is like, one of the sort of things you mentioned is like procurement as a kind of industrial policy. Um, my question is like, if you had to construct, something like that, like where is power? Where is the government? Well, let's in this case like pick the U.S. government and try to build something that matched that slide. Where would you say the U.S. has relatively more, like the government has relatively more power? Does it have power in any of these sort of settings, or really no? Like, kind of imagine no on search, a little bit on model development. Kind of curious.
I mean, the government is a heterogeneous organization, right? It has different forms of power. So one of the forms of power is its regulatory power, its ability to shape the way that all of these firms are behaving through enforcement of the law. And we've seen, probably the most significant steps toward the exertion of that power from the DOJ, from the FTC over the past couple of years. But they're up against a very real challenge in that they're trying to regulate companies that have now amassed, capital that is larger than many nation states' GDP. And so how to enforce that power in a way that is going to meaningfully change the behavior of those firms rather than just amount to like a budget line for a fine that they account for and then, keep, up to business as usual. That's a difficult regulatory problem. So they have the power to enforce the law. However, the penalty exerted by that enforcement is a place that remains somewhat in question. You're right that procurement is another significant lever of power because they have they're a significant customer base for AI firms. They and any sort of guidelines such as those released by the Office of Management and Budget recently are going to shape that very large customer base. So the Office of Management and Budget included for the first time some new requirements that products that are used by government agencies must have a certain set of requirements for interoperability. That kind of requirement is in some ways a fairly, minimal, but a check on that power of the large firms. Then you get to public funding and investment, which is kind of where the main focus of what I was just discussing is placed. Now, the scale at which public funding is being proposed is really not a meaningful change to the power center. So I think there you need to have these levers working really seamlessly in tandem with one another if you're going to get to the place, get to any sort of meaningful change. So you need to have competition enforcers moving in ways that start to break up that ecosystem dominance. You need to have procurement mandates that set baseline standards that sort of change the practices through the power of the pocketbook, and then public funding that really tries to go to places that the market is not going to incentivize any sort of investment, and possibly like don't even invest specifically in AI that sort of exists within this model, but instead try and fund, the work of folks who are really, more on the ground to surface up problems that need to be solved, rather than, again, sort of fund that technology in search of its solution.
Um, yes, yes, and yes. One thing I'm kind of like, in some sense, you were absolutely right to say that like the little, pennies that the government is throwing in is not going to be, it's not, I mean, obviously $2 billion is significant no matter how you slice it, but it's like relative to existing sort of, like it's not buying you that much power per se. And the kind of thing I was wondering is like, some of the things you poke at in that graph are like things like social media, right? You don't think immediately, oh, this is an AI thing. We're relevant to AI if you say social media. But clearly, there is relevant data, relevant sort of ways of capture to sort of deploy on top of existing market power. Like if you control search, obviously you can put in AI there and massively sort of, it's a vector. And it makes me think, obviously the US government has huge amounts of investment and has like, offers lots and lots of services, right? That you could just tap an AI on top of, just exactly the way that Gemini just shows up automatically on top of search. And then I have no idea what that could be useful for, but I'm kind of very curious whether there's ways of deploying power that we haven't really sort of thought about because we're not used to thinking about public services in that frame. Um,
I think that part of the challenge here is that, if we're talking about devoting taxpayer money, it's really important to have clarity of like what the trade-offs are. And, I live in New York City, where like a lot of this has been really crystallized recently, where, like we had libraries that are getting shut down on the weekends and even starting to be like on the weekdays, and now they've reopened them after a public outcry. But where is the money going, and where is it not going as a result? I think we need to have very clear answers on who's going to be served, if we're going to be sinking significant amounts of money into this space.
I have some spicy questions to follow up later on this question, but Brandon.
We'll get to them.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated that recentering, and I very much agree that's what we need to do. So my
Oh, brief pause. Could you introduce yourself, Brandon?
yeah, I never introduced myself. You're right. 0 out of like 5 times. My name is Brandon. I'm a product manager. I work with Josh at MetaGov, and lately I've been working with Pete, writing a paper about public AI utility companies. So, and that gives away my answer, because I feel like what's missing from this conversation is a recognition that governments don't just build like government agencies and institutions and like do things for free. Governments also set up operating institutions which generate a boatload of revenue, and they take the surplus and allocate it towards the sustainable maintenance of the commons that sustains that institution or that utility. And they take the surplus and use it to allocate improved service delivery and expansion of the network to reach new needs. And if you look at the history of technology innovation, there are so many amazing things that happen whenever you have these kind of institutions that have these surpluses that they can use for development. The government used to be the person who's not the government used to be responsible for setting a lot of things up, and now it's just big tech. So for me, I think that rather than saying like, what does the government need, what gaps is like government spending or investment, but basically like giving away public money being used for free, I think there's another set of questions, which is what kinds of services could be run as public utilities, where there's then an operating revenue and surplus, and that's a way to then connect up new people to that utility. And anyways, I just think that that's what's bizarre to me about the current ecosystem, is that we've seemed to almost like take it for granted that governments have to be like almost like donating money. But I don't think that's true. I think there's lots of reasons to think that open source, for example, if you took open source, even just serving open source models, they don't have to do the development. They could just build the compute and take the margins, right? Anyways, there's so many ways to say it, but I think that's one thing that's off the table that historically has led to a lot of these public access expansion.
I don't think that was a question. So Sarah, if you have
Well,
any comments.
I felt like Sarah was trying to open up floor to like provocation. So that was my provocation. Okay,
Yes.
so the
Yeah,
question
no,
would
it's a
be,
great provocation. And I know B's working on the paper with you, so maybe if they have anything in addition.
Oh, I was going to go in a different direction, and working on the paper with is a generous way to describe Brandon's leadership on this work. So, but yes, really excited about this. I guess I have a different provocation, which is like you mentioned that, and this is a phrase I think we hear a lot in the kind of like responsible AI communities, that like AI is a solution looking for a problem. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that the problem that people developing AI want to solve is labor automation. Like they know what they want to do. They want to reduce the number of humans involved in a process. Like, I don't think that I think that like right now, the problem that AI is being developed for is empowering capital and diminishing labor power. And like, I don't, to me, that's like that. I don't like that problem. I don't want, like, that's not what I would prioritize, but I don't think that it's true that there isn't a priority. And I actually think that I really appreciate the work that you named around like reframing what innovation means and what's like worth striving for, because I think that by masking it under this frame of innovation, we do often lose sight of the kind of true, like there is a real motive behind this, and like we can argue about whether that's a good thing or not, right? Like we can argue what type of labor automation makes sense or whatever, but I do think that right now what I see is a field in which, and maybe you know a better term to describe this, but I think that there are different types of innovation. There's I like to use the examples of like there's the lever, which, you know, is like a force multiplier. You know, what used to take 10 men can now be done with one, or whatever. And then there's the microscope, which, like, no matter how many men you threw at the problem, they were never going to be able to see those itty bitty things. And so I'm curious, in the work that you've been doing in this kind of like thinking about what does it mean to reframe what is innovative, like, do we have better ways to describe those types of problems? And I'm definitely self-interested in this because our team at Aspen Digital is doing some work to work on kind of community aligned benchmarks for AI. So like, what are the things we wish research was striving toward? And I think that like figuring out how to articulate this, like, it's not just time or labor saving, but there's like some actual capability modification, like that. I don't know how we describe or define or know like beforehand what's a lever and what's a microscope, but I'm curious if you've run into this in some of the work that you all have been doing.
I guess there's sort of like two layers at which we might think this through. I mean, one, like what you've described around labor automation is like, it's kind of a function of capitalism, not to be the one to just like go there, but like if AI in its development is motivated by, you know, ultimately trying to pursue profit, then it's going to pursue certain kinds of functions, and those have largely been you know, austerity measures, labor automation or augmentation, and ratcheting up of surveillance and control is another that I would throw in the mix. So I think that trajectory is a function as well of like the dominance of industry in the field of AI research itself too, that they, you know, like Nur Ahmed wrote a paper on this in Science not that long ago that tracked the very steady uptick in industry presence in the leading machine learning conferences, that the incentive structures and the what are the hard problems to be working on have been shaped by industry. I do see another separate but important thread here, which has to do with the methods that have dominated AI as a field too, which tend to be more application forward, like what can I do with this set of capabilities, as opposed to what the traditional sciences and social sciences tend to do, which is more of a scientific method style approach where you have a hypothesis and a null hypothesis and you're trying to test against it. You start with the question and you develop the methods to effectively answer the question. AI as a field kind of puts that backwards and starts from the methods. And so I think that there is this like larger epistemic set of questions around like the way that AI development proceeds tends to start with the solution and then find problems that it is fit to. And that's another, parallel track that I think won't solely be dealt with if you just, remove if you attempt to remove the like profit motive from the question.
Before we go on to our next round of questions, I want to pause for one moment and, as for tradition in the Public AI seminar, invite folks to briefly unmute in the next 3 seconds, and I'll count down and give
can
Sarah
I innovate? Josh, can I interrupt to do an innovation? People are asking what an innovation is. I'd like to innovate on the tradition, if I may, because due to sound canceling, you can't actually hear the clapping. So my innovation is that we all unmute and say clap, 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 clap. I'll be doing it. You're welcome to join me. Otherwise, Sarah will be greeted by silence, which I don't think conveys the level of gratitude. So that's what we can then discuss.
Let's clap and say clap.
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, there we go.
All right, 3, 2, 1.
Clap, clap, clap,
Clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap, clap.
That's actually hilarious.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for the
Alex,
innovation.
very loudly there.